before I do that, it's to introduce the panelists. And so I'm going to start with Stephanie Derrick. Stephanie comes to us from Los Angeles. She is a screenwriter. She comes with a fascination of history of religion in the modern era. Her interest especially is delved into Britain and America. She has a PhD from the University of Stirling. She has written on C.S. Lewis, a title which is going to be fascinating in my mind, alone as a title, The Fame of C.S. Lewis, a controversialist reception in Britain and America. And so we'll ask her about that and a number of other things, but would you join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Derrick? Yeah, come on in. There's seats up here. Y'all come on in. There are seats off to the sides. You just got to be bold and walk down the aisle. It's not church. Nobody's going to ask you why you're responding to the invitation. Next, I have, make sure I've got them right. Yeah, Jadiel Perez is next. Now, Jadiel is an assistant professor of humanities and sciences at Villanova. And I went on the internet and I looked up his student reviews to find out if they like him. They all say he gets 5 stars and they want to take anything he teaches and they want all of his courses. He's a fascinating fellow. His father is originally from Guatemala and his mother is from Puerto Rico. So he calls himself Puerto Rican. And he has an undergraduate degree in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He went to Texas Tech of the North, it's called Harvard. Harvard to get his MDiv, and then he went over to Oxford where he got his DPhil at Oxford. He wrote the first theological dissertation out of Oxford University on C.S. Lewis. Others had written on C.S. Lewis from an English perspective, literature perspective, but he produced the first doctoral work on C.S. Lewis in theology thinking. And so he is just a splendid fella. He was president of the C.S. Lewis Oxford Glee Club or something. I don't know what it was while he was over there. And he's come down to help us with our panel. He'll also be doing a lecture in the morning. Would you join me in thanking Professor Perez? I'm going to skip over Amy, our feature for the weekend, and come to my friend and buddy, Jerry Root. Now, Jerry is a professor emeritus at Wheaton College, where he taught for over 24 years. He lectured here in 2019, one of our most popular lectures. He's written on the quotable C.S. Lewis. He's written on C.S. Lewis and the Problem of Evil, The Surprising Imagination of Lewis. But one of the most provocative things I can tell you in my memory bank was when he had me come up and speak to one of his classes at Wheaton. He taught a class on evangelism and how to share your faith. This wasn't a required course. It was an elective. He had over 40 students paying Wheaton tuition to take a class on how to share their faith. And he gave me the honor of getting to come up one day and teach, and it was right after they had finished an assignment, which was something like ride a bus this weekend in Chicago and tell 3 people about your faith, or something like that, and then write a report on it. I mean, this is the class. So when I went in there to teach, I gave each of the students a blank sheet of paper. I said, you've got a pen. I don't know your writing. No one's going to see this but me. I would like all of you to write down your biggest personal challenge to believing in God. And out of the 44 students, I think, that were there at the time, 60 to 70% all wrote that their biggest personal struggle was, how can there be an almighty, all-loving God and evil still in this world? And so this is a particular problem that Jerry's dealt with, not just as a thinker about it, but in practical ways dealing with students. And we're really valued to have Jerry with us today. Will you thank me for having Jerry Root? Now I get to introduce Amy Orr-Ewing. For several years, Pastor David, Pastor Derrick, and a number of us have attended the parliamentary prayer breakfast in England. They didn't have it this summer, but the summer before, I had just excitement. I mean, it's really cool to be in this, 1,000-year-old hall where they've got little stickers or engravings on the ground of this person was beheaded here, this person was enthroned there, and you're in this incredible atmosphere. You've got some great singing. You've got this breakfast. One of the years I was there was the year Boris Johnson was one table over, and I'm taking little pictures with my phone, but I'm behind him. I can't tell if it's Boris Johnson or Rod Stewart because they both have the hair. And it was Boris because he got up and walked out in the middle of it right before they prayed for him. And Amy Orr-Ewing spoke. And it mesmerized all of us. Her eloquence, winsomeness, and gospel conviction rang with clarity that would break a crystal goblet. It was magnificent demonstration of the glory of our Lord. And I just turned to Pastor David and to Pastor Derrick, and I don't remember who else was at the table, but my comment was, we've got to get her to the library. And we were able to get her to come in on a panel since then, but really we've been waiting for this weekend to have her here. And she has just sent her twins off to college, and in the middle of her sorrow and lamenting has come to Houston, Texas to experience the cool autumn that we have here. And we are so delighted and honored. Academically, I'll put it this way. Our son spent 12 years at Oxford. He took a master's degree. He took a DPhil. He taught, and I called him and I said, let me tell you who's coming. I'm so excited. Well, he's already looked her up on the internet. And he said, Dad, you may not realize this, but she took her first theology degree at Christ Church and she got a first. He said, that's an incredible accomplishment. He said, first of all, it's so hard to get into theology at Christ Church. That she even got in is amazing. But he said, you'll recall at the end of 3 years, you take the exams, and in 2 weeks, you take an exam over every course you've taken those 3 years. And when she got a first, Dad, that means she's top 10%. He said, so she's a great writer. She's incredibly smart. She has good retention, and she's quick on her feet. She goes then and gets a master's degree. She gets a doctor's degree. She works at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. She has written, she has spoken. She just finished speaking at the Scottish Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast. She is an incredible person to gift us with her time this weekend. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing? Okay, the table is set. The table is set with C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain, but that's a springboard. That's maybe a main course, but we got to have some appetizers. We've got to have some dessert. So we're going to expand this beyond just the problem of pain. Of course, C.S. Lewis has written also on A Grief Observed, which is a later set of his thoughts about the issues of this. But if we're going to start with the problem of pain, it's that logical meeting point of how can we have an omnipotent God who is perfect in his goodness and yet allows suffering in this world. And Lewis writes on it where he delves into it in his typical fashion. He allegorizes, he humorizes, he gets serious, and he puts together something that is not just an intellectual treatise, but it's also an experiential salve, if you will. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to know which one of you austere people would like to give a 3 to 4 minute synopsis of The Problem of Pain from C.S. Lewis, recognizing that you can't go longer than 3 to 4 minutes because, and I've got the watch right here, because we won't get through today if you do. So who wants it? Jerry, go.
Yeah, I'll just say right off the bat, that's what I'm speaking on this evening. So if they want to get a longer version.
Right,
but he begins...
3-minute version of tonight.
He begins with the issue of God being all-powerful. He starts with Thomas Aquinas. Nothing which implies a contradiction exists in the divine omnipotence, which means there's some things that God can't do. If he's good, he can't do evil. If he's loving, he can't be unloving. If he's just, he can't be unfair. If he's immutable and unchanging, he can't be capricious. So he starts there. If he creates us with free will, then he can't remove the consequences of free will, or that's to give us the gift and not give us the gift at the same time. And he explores that. Then he looks at divine goodness. And he's trying to ask the question, do any of us not have experiences of goodness that's painful? My word, have you never been to a dentist? He asks. And there are things when I had cancer. The doctor did a horrible incision on my body, but he gave me life. I was a football player. You have to take it by faith now. But when I played football, our coaches drove us and we won championships. We complained all the time. So there's that issue too. There's also the perspective of seeing the big picture, not just the little one. Every one of us in our moment of pain has difficulty seeing beyond it. I cut my finger once to the bone. It was less than 1% of my body, but it got all my attention. But over time, you begin to get perspective on these things, and Lewis helps us in that way.
That's fantastic. You did that in 2 minutes.
It's the fear of Mark Lanier on me.
Yeah. Woo. I'm feeling powerful. C.S. Lewis in America is viewed as really smart, at least in evangelical circles. I should be a little more specific. Is generally viewed as really smart, as good at theology, as good at trying to produce intellectual arguments in a way that will relate to people. And yet, if you've been to England, you'll find out that for decades, C.S. Lewis was not taken so seriously. And in fact, his Christian writings probably hindered his career in academia. And I think, Jadil, if you would talk to people a little bit about that history of C.S. Lewis in that way to help us frame the idea that now he's being considered a theologian of sorts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So like Dr. Root, I'm going to give a lecture tomorrow morning at 9, I believe it's 9:30, that covers this more fully. But the idea is something like this. Lewis never studied theology, and he never taught theology. And yet he's writing best-selling theology books that gain international recognition. So some of his colleagues in Oxford thought you can't really be a serious academic theologian if you've never studied it, never taught it, and you're writing books like the Screwtape Letters, like The Problem of Pain. One of his colleagues said, the problem of pain is bad enough, and Lewis just made it worse, was his comment, right? And he was trying to say, basically, just leave it to the professionals, right? You're not a professional theologian, leave it to the professionals. And we start to see that this idea of Lewis was still around when other theologians were training at Oxford, like N.T. Wright, Rowan Williams, Alistair McGrath. When they were doing their undergraduate studies, they said it was very common for their professors to look down on Lewis and say, he just gives very simple answers to these complex questions. So there's a history of tracing, looking down on Lewis and saying he's not a serious or a theological thinker worth taking seriously. I think the good news is that the definitions of terms change over time and over location. So what we mean by theology or theologian here and now could change in 15 or 20 years, or it could be different from a community down the street, right? So one of the points that Alistair McGrath, I think, really brilliantly makes, he raises a question: who gets to decide who's a theologian? Who gets to define the term? So up until Lewis's time, it was academic, professional theologians, right? They're keeping this inner circle. They get to decide who's in and who's out. Well, there's a different way of defining terms, and it's basically through reception. So if there's a community of people that think you're a theologian, that trust you to answer theological questions, well, you're functioning as a theologian for them, even if you don't want to call yourself a theologian. So the basic response is something like this: academics would love to monopolize the power of defining who's a theologian, but hundreds of thousands of Christians all around the world have trusted Lewis to answer very meaningful theological questions. He's functioning as a theologian for many different communities, especially across England and America. So now it looks like it's very difficult to try to rule him out as a serious theological thinker.
Oh, that's great. So that perception issue, and maybe even some differences there, it's got me very intrigued, Stephanie, just off the title of your book, The Fame of C.S. Lewis, a Controversialist's Reception in Britain and America. Tell us what you mean. Tell us what your book's about.
Sure. So I also grew up in evangelical circles. So C.S. Lewis's name was constantly mentioned from the pulpit. His books were on church tables, and he was just part of the ethos of evangelical culture that I was familiar with growing up not far from here in Jackson, Mississippi. So I took a course at Honorary Divinity School with a guy from Belfast, and he mentioned in that course on the history of evangelicalism that where he was from, Lewis there wasn't the enthusiasm that he noticed in the States. So that got my attention, and it made me wonder, well, that's strange. Well, what is it about us in evangelical circles that are so drawn to Lewis if in his home country there's a little bit more mixed feelings? So that's what kicked off my project, became a PhD, and then a book on the fame of C.S. Lewis, where I traced sort of Lewis's rise to fame, how he became famous, and then what happened after that, why he was remembered, what in our societies helped ensure that his books remained popular, but then also how is it different between the UK and America? And that was kind of a way of using Lewis as a control for looking at evangelical culture, especially, but American Christian culture, as compared to British culture and British Christian culture. So Lewis was kind of, for me, the control and the kind of an experiment. So it was very, very revealing. That it's a very complicated answer. That's why I took a whole book to answer, and 10 years of research. I can't sum it up. People love to ask me to sum it up really, really quickly, but you can hear me talk about it tomorrow if you want.
All right, and you'll be giving a class on that in the morning as well.
Yes.
Thank you for that, and I'm going to come back to you on it because I've got a few more questions, but I don't want to. Tomorrow the space is limited for you guys to about 50 or 60 people, and a lot of the people who are taking the certificate program here have reserved slots, so a lot of these people won't, and so I may ask you just a couple of little questions if you don't mind. All right, so I've crossed over into the land of old people somewhere in life, and I did my schooling back in the late 70s and early 80s, and we're in the States. I had C.S. Lewis books as part of my textbooks. I had to read, though I was zealously reading anyway, but it was required reading for many of my classes, to read Problem of Pain, to read Miracles, to read Mere Christianity, to read a number of different Lewis works. And so to me, I sit here and I listen to this, and I have awareness of this from before, of course, the panel, and I try to figure out why. Is it because a prophet is without honor in his own country? And so, to the extent Lewis was so incredibly successful outside of England, and these professors aren't in the popular way, that they're able to dismiss him to justify their own accomplishments? Or is it the innate hostility toward the way Lewis presents rationality as being valid ways to pursue a true biblical faith and legitimately producing it? I don't know why he wasn't received, and I'd be curious what y'all's opinions are.
Received seriously as a literary scholar. So we don't want to exaggerate it too much. I mean, I spoke to a lot of people, current, and then also historically. So I looked at this over time and how it changed over time. And so Lewis was and is very well respected as a literary historian, and his work was groundbreaking, and he was actually held in quite awe in his own day as a literary critic, and just as a powerhouse of an intellectual. He was a powerhouse intellectual among many in his day, and it was just the culture of Oxbridge kind of bred this amazing. I mean, it was just it was like this. It was kind of like a prep school atmosphere where it was like very competitive and masculine, and they loved to kind of jostle with each other and compete with each other. And the jostling and competing was over just how brilliant you could be, what you could quote, and like what connections you could make. And the dinner table, was just awe-inspiring. So, and that was his atmosphere, and that was what he like lived and breathed. And and he was very well known and very well respected. It was, like Jadiel said, the fact that he stepped outside of his professional alley and he went into some popular, became a popular writer in a field that was not his training. That's where some eyebrows were raised, and it was about kind of change. Professionalism was really kind of rising, and we take for granted like the professionalism of the 20th and 21st century, but it was really kind of developing at that time, and you kind of stayed in your lane. That was just the culture. So the fact that he stepped out of it, and I would add that he stepped out of it because he was asked to. In the 30s, just to give a little bit of context, in the 30s, Lewis was, just pounding away at his like amazing literary critical career and his scholarship. He was tutoring, he was writing things of interest to him, but there was a decade after he converted until 2 months after the Second World War began. That was like the first time that he made a foray into apologetic writing. With first, it was he was asked by the vicar of St. Mary's the Virgin to preach, and that was the first time he kind of stepped out in this role. And then he preached that sermon, and it was called "None Other Gods: Culture in Wartime." This is 2 months after the war began. And then after that, Ashley Sampson, he heard that, and he invited Lewis to do The Problem of Pain for his Christian Challenge series, based on the quality of that he saw in that sermon. And then Lewis was asked again, based on The Problem of Pain, by James Welch, the director of the religious broadcasting at the BBC, to do what became Mere Christianity, the broadcast during the Second World War. And it also produced an invitation from W.R. Matthews, the Dean of St. Paul's, who wrote to the chaplain in chief of the Royal Air Force that he wanted to provide funds for a lectureship to the Royal Air Force bases, and he suggested Lewis be the person that do that. So it was all of these. My point is that it was invitations. Lewis was content doing his work and kind of staying in his sphere, and he was writing some creative things, but he was doing his job. And then all these pesky clerics were coming up him and being like, can you do a sermon? Can you write this book? Can you do this? And he did it out of a sense of duty, and that's kind of where we get the beginning of his apologetic.
All right, I want to chase this down a little bit more, but I'm going to pause for a commercial break for our library. In our C.S. Lewis collection, we actually have Lewis's handwritten sermon that he gave in I guess it was September of 1939. It was Learning in Wartime.
That was October 22nd,
October 22nd,
1939.
1939. War had broken out in September, and the big issue as the Oxford student population was coming back to school is we're fresh off the heels of a First World War where so many people were drafted and so many people died. Here we are at Hitler's already invaded Poland. We've got another war here. France is going to go. What fruit is there in coming and studying the works of William Shakespeare while this stuff's going on in Europe and while war is afoot? And shouldn't we not be wasting our time reading newspapers with comic strips in them when we should be doing something more serious with our life? And so he goes to St. Mary's and he delivers this outstanding sermon, but it's all handwritten. And we've got his original handwritten sermon in the library. It later gets published with some editing. So he would say things in the written sermon that he wouldn't put in the publishing book. So I think in the written sermon, he would say things like, you'd have to be not stupid, but I think he said an idiot or something like that to believe. And when he published it, it was, you'd need to be uninformed. And he would do those types of things before he published it. But it was so important a work that I was asked to come up and teach at a law school that was reading the work, not for religious purposes, for secular. This is a secular class that I was to teach in New York City. And they didn't know I had the original address. They just asked me, would you come lecture on this work? And I said, of course, can I bring it? And they said, no, we've already, all the students will have read it. And I said, no, but can I bring the address? Oh, no, all the students have the address. They will have read it. I said, no, I have the address. Can I bring it? What? And so we unlocked it, but you'll want to see that. All right. I want to know, anybody else want to venture out, though, into why, at least in theology, though I think maybe in some ways it affected his career beyond theology, that he was addressing all of this. I could be wrong. But anybody else want to weigh in on why? Why did it have such a in some ways, limited reception among his peers and others?
I'm not convinced that he did. I think the thing is way more nuanced than that. Some people rejected him, some people accepted him. My experience at Oxford was, if you do good work, people accept you. When somebody challenges somebody like Amy Orr-Ewing and says, you shouldn't do this work, and she's courageous enough to lean into it, and then does first-class honor work, this dissipates. But you could be intimidated by that sort of thing, and there were intimidators there. But my doctoral supervisor was Basil Mitchell, the eminent philosopher of religion. He worked with Lewis with the Socratic Club. He was the vice president, and he was a committed Christian. And he said to me, people at Oxford don't mind, generally, because there are some people who are obviously hostile, but generally they don't mind if a Christian's here as long as they do good work. And some people could think, I'm a Christian, so I should get a pass, and they want to do sloppy work. At Oxford, they respect good work. So I think people did respect Lewis. And the other thing, too, he wrote a book called English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. To write that book, he read every book written in English in the 16th century, every book translated into English in the original language it was written, Old French, Italian, Latin, and in translation, so he could compare and make judgments that were fair-minded and informed. That's the century of the Reformation. There's about a 120-page section of that 700-page book called the Age of Religious Controversy. And this is a guy who's got his head around this stuff more than most. I don't know a theologian that's read both sides of the Reformation completely. He was very informed. and he even said himself, I'm not a theologian. He didn't try to traipse himself out there as a theologian, but he was not an uninformed academic. He did good academic work. And you mentioned on learning in wartime. He spoke a sermon at Magdalen College before he gave that one at St. Mary's called De Futilitate. And the students said, it's all futile. Why should we go on with an academic education? And Lewis said, all judgments imply a standard. What's the standard by which you make the judgment? This is futile. And when he preached the other sermon at St. Mary's, he said, war does not increase death. He could have said aging doesn't, accidents don't, all these things. Disease doesn't increase death because death is total in every generation. And human life has been lived, in a sense, on the precipice. And if we waited till things were good before we did anything, we'd just sit around and wait all the time. And so we function awkwardly. As a matter of fact, if you're not awkward someplace in your life, just not growing. And he's challenging the students that way.
JDO, weigh in.
Yeah, one question I have is, if Lewis's scholarship in English was outstanding and well regarded and respected, I wonder why Oxford didn't make him a full professor until Cambridge already put a ring on it in 1954, right? Tolkien was on the committee at University of Cambridge, and they were opening a medieval and Renaissance chair, and Tolkien convinced the committee there's only one guy for this. It has to be Lewis. Lewis, of course, turned it down twice because of his Gardiner Paxford, which is a ridiculous reason. He didn't like to travel, but he said, oh, I don't want to move to Cambridge. And Tolkien said, are you kidding? You'll triple the pay. You don't have to teach these pesky undergrads anymore. Like, come over to Cambridge. He finally accepts. And then Oxford freaked out and said, oh, no, we're losing Lewis. We'll offer you a full professorship. And Lewis said, yeah, it's too late. You know, I'm going to Cambridge for the last 9 years of his career. So I think that instead of seeing his theological works as an addition to his scholarship, as someone that says, wow, we have someone who does English scholarship and can write interesting theology books, I think that he upset just the right people that saw the theology works as a diminishment of his overall scholarly output. And I definitely think it's very complicated. I think there are admirers of him, but I think that generally, I think the gatekeepers, the people responsible for promotions, didn't like him for a period of time.
And yet that is the time period where Oxford would not give him a full professorship.
It's not the sole reason, though. There was this conflict that he had when he suggested that they vote for Adam Fox as professor of poetry over another guy. And so they went and voted in Adam Fox, and he did a terrible job. And people held that against Lewis. So there were a lot of reasons why.
You know, we need to be careful not to make Lewis a saint, not that you are, but he could be a bully. He was known for being a bully, actually, to students and to colleagues. He had that reputation. I've documented that very well. So there were internal politics within Magdalen and within Oxford that Lewis contributed to, and not always in the best way, and that should also be given airtime.
As if he suffered for his faith, because there was some of that too, he persisted in his apologetic work. In other words, his commitments were beyond anything the Oxford University had. His commitments were to the Father and to the people who he wanted to reach.
Okay. You mentioned, Amy, Dorothy Sayers. Give us, she's not as well known in the States as Lewis. A lot of folks may know that she is. When I'm done, you get this microphone, okay? Yeah, yours just evidently went kaput. It's a German word. People may know, oh yeah, she wrote novels. Oh, she wrote, maybe plays. And oh, she was Catholic. And oh, she was but most Americans don't know that much about her. And they may have read one detective story, but not much more. So would you give us a primer in Dorothy Sayers?
So Dorothy Sayers was born right towards the end of the 1800s to a clergyman father in Oxford, and then grew up in the vicarage. She won the Gilchrist Prize to go for modern languages at Oxford, and she was absolutely a brilliant student in modern languages and graduated with her peer group. It wasn't until a few years later that she was one of the first of the cohort of first women to be granted the degree from Oxford, because up to then women were allowed to take all the classes and take all the exams, and of course she beat all the men. but wasn't actually allowed to get the honour of the degree until a bit later. After university, she worked in an advertising agency, and she came up with the phrase, "It pays to advertise." She did all the advertising, which is still pretty iconic in Britain, for Guinness, the drink, and for Coleman's mustard. She had a massive impact, actually, in that field in her 20s. And she was a Christian, while she was working that advertising firm, she didn't really want to do that for the rest of her life. So she started writing detective fiction, which was kind of a hobby, but it was also a beginning of her engagement with the ideas of truth and evidence, and how narratives actually help us resolve what reality is, discerning imposter narratives, so untrue stories about how things resolve from the true resolution to a scenario. Her detective fiction, her detective is called Lord Peter Wimsey. It became stratospherically successful, and she and Agatha Christie were the two sort of best-selling detective fiction writers. And she also wrote articles and things about that category of fiction. So towards the end of her 20s, she also had quite a troubled personal life. She'd fallen in love with a writer who was part of the Bloomsbury set called John Cornus, who wasn't a Christian, and he wanted to have sex before marriage with her, and she didn't want to do that as a Christian. Her convictions were, no, I'm not going to do that. And the teaching of the Church of England at that time was also that you shouldn't use contraception, and he wanted to do that, and she wasn't going to do that. So he went off to America and left her behind. She was utterly heartbroken and fell into an affair with a motorbike mechanic. And because she didn't love him, ended up having sex with him and got pregnant. So she's working in an advertising agency. Her father is a senior clergyman in the Church of England. She's a professing Christian, and she hid the pregnancy from everyone. Everyone thought she just got enormously fat. And she went off on her own the weekend the baby was due to be delivered, gave birth to her son, and gave him to her cousin, Ivy, who'd been a very kind of close Christian connection in her childhood to look after, and she funded raising him. So that's all happening. As that's happening, she's now this successful detective fiction writer, and she's asked to write a narrative play for Britain's cathedrals. Basically, there was this culture of putting on these kind of big plays, and thousands of people would come to the cathedral to see the plays. And the plays she wrote, Canterbury Cathedral and then other cathedrals, were so successful that the British train companies had to put on more trains so people could go and see them. As a result of that, this man, Welch, at the BBC, saw that and thought, that's fascinating. Here's someone who can communicate in a kind of narrative way about the Christian faith that is engaging. And they invited her to write a series of plays which became called The Man Born to be King, which were broadcast on the BBC, and millions of people tuned in to listen to these plays, these cycles of plays based on the life of Jesus, but with Jesus and the disciples articulating the gospel stories in a language that people could relate to. So what they'd seen is something in a stained glass window, or something very remote spoken by a sort of weird priest far, far away from real life, became alive. And there's a connection to be made between a huge increase in church attendance and these plays. So people really were engaged. At the same time, she also then began to write essays and broadcast talks on the BBC about the Christian faith, really engaging with what was going on in the Second World War and what Christianity had to say to that. Huge theme for her was the creed, and in particular the incarnation. She then also wrote theological essays. Her most famous essays are probably on work and vocation, and on the role of women, and particularly women as witnesses in the New Testament, and what that means about the Christian faith. She wrote something called The Mind of the Maker, which was a book on the Holy Trinity, which makes a kind of analogy of a writer and applies this idea of God as creator in his Trinitarian being through an analogy of a writer and how that kind of works. And it was a work of Christian apologetics, really. And then towards the end of her life and career, she suddenly got really interested in Dante and learned classical Italian, and Penguin commissioned her to translate Dante's three-part poem into the English language in a readable format, and more people have read Dante's poem because of Dorothy Sayers in English than all the previous translations put together. So she was pretty successful.
Well, you have just gotten like a 1-hour course in Dorothy Sayers. That was incredible. That was wonderful. One of the things that has always impressed me with her, and it in part was through the writings that she would do, where she took the Gospels and she would write about them in a very historically accurate or biblically accurate way, but in very modern language that people could grab. And it reminded me, Jerry, of you, because your interest in a book like The Problem of Pain is not simply the intellectual interest of how do we resolve these intellectual concepts, but it's what difference does it make in our life and in the lives of the people we're around. And I want you to talk about that. And then I'm going to come back to you, Stephanie, and ask you about the power of story in general. You're a screenwriter. The power of story to be able to help people grasp and address things that sometimes you can't address effectively any other way. And so I'll come to you next, and then we'll go back to you, Jadil. But
Well, it's one thing to get our minds around the problem of pain. It's another thing to get our hearts around it and our emotional life around it. And again, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes we have to pitch our tent at the place that could lead to bitterness, but we don't want to build our house there. So how do we process? And it's interesting that C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Reflections on the Psalms. Have you ever talked with people before and they say, oh, I love the Psalms, they're so comforting? I say, I don't think you're reading the same ones I'm reading. You know, how blessed are those who bash Babylonian babies' heads against the rocks, or I pray, Lord, all my enemies' children will be orphans. I've heard sermon series on Psalms, and pastors avoid those Psalms. C.S. Lewis does not. He thinks we need them. And I don't know about you, but have you ever felt like you wanted to shake somebody who hurt you, or somebody you saw hurt somebody else? Is your faith in irrelevancy at that point? Or does God give you a template in the Psalms where you can press out the pus before him because he's big enough to handle it, so you don't go take it out on somebody else? And Lewis writes about this. He also says, when we see in those Psalms, the psalmist is so upset about somebody, it's good for us to take stock. Have we been the person that has produced that kind of response in another? And Lewis looks at this, and I think that this is extremely important, but also sometimes we're suffering and it's not of our making. I think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his poem, New Year 1945. If it be ours to drink the cup of grieving, even at the dregs of pain at thy command, we will not falter, thankfully receiving all that comes from thy loving hand. And even at the end of his life, in a Nazi prison camp, he was still even ministering to his prison guards. This is a guy who was able to triumph.
You raise a great point, and I'll throw in another commercial. It's time for another commercial break. There is a Bonhoeffer biographical film that's going to be in popular movie theaters. It's been a lot of work. It's been ongoing for a number of years now, and it's due out in November. And you need to put it in your placeholder. I've seen some of the trailers and previews over the last year as they've been filming, and it holds promise to be a very good film. I mean, you don't know till you see it, but you'll want to register for that. The screenwriters did a great job. Speaking of screenwriting, we have one of those here. Talk to us about the power of story, Stephanie.
Well, I don't know if I'm the one to tell you why story is so effective, or why we're so receptive through story. I think others have worked there a lot better than I, and I'm a newbie to screenwriting, so wish me well. But I can tell you that Lewis's first love was story, and that was what he was bathed in, like as a young person, as a teenager. That was his first love, poem and storytelling, and it was about heart, like he and his imagination. He loved dwelling in the imaginative space and dwelling in other people's imaginations via story, and also creating his own. Went hand in hand, those creative processes. And that actually, as I mentioned before, he ventured into, he was a scholar, of course, so he was doing that academic work. But as far as pleasure writing, he was asked to do that popular apologetics, and that's what brought him into that world. But he always loved storytelling, and that was his first loves. And in fact, after a while of doing this apologetic writing, defending Christianity, explaining this doctrine, explaining that doctrine, responding to people who were writing to him, largely from America, asking him about his opinion about this doctrine or that doctrine, he wrote his friend that he said, I think it was something to the effect, I'm not going to quote it correctly, but it was, there's a doctrine never seems so far away from me as when I've just successfully defended it. And it tired him. There was something taxing to him about that process of explaining, like he did in The Problem of Pain, Christian doctrine. But he could relax into story and story writing. I actually think that the Chronicles of Narnia were born out of a kind of being tired of writing apologetics. Jerry, maybe you can comment on this or what you think about this, but as I was going through his biography, that's how it felt to me. He was doing all of this work that was asked of him to explain his Christian faith, and then at some point he was like, I just need to get back to storytelling. And so the Chronicles of Narnia were born. And Greta Gerwig, speaking of screenwriting, Greta Gerwig, who did the Barbie movie, is writing a script for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So all of this will be rehashed. It'll be in headlines, and it'll be fun to see what Greta Gerwig does with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
So I've spent a lot of time studying storytelling. As a trial lawyer, that's what I do. I tell stories. And so I've read a number of psychologists who explain that storytelling is powerful on so many different levels. And one of them is it will bypass our natural defenses, because we'll start relating to characters in the story or facts and narrative in the story. And it plugs into a whole different set of neural synapses in our brain, a whole different set of than just that logical, I'm going to process it. I know this is right politically, or I know this is right, blah, 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 whatever groundwork it may be. When you start hearing it, it's kind of like King David. He had his rationalizations in place until Nathan the prophet tells him a story about this fellow who only had this one family sheep, and it just got robbed. And then David would find indignancy. Jesus would tell stories. We're hardwired, science teaches, for stories. They can transform us. And so within the framework of Lewis, you've got not just a theologian writing exposés, but you've got exactly what Stephanie's saying. You've got a fellow who could step into a story instead and then find within that story, still writing, I would argue, I think Alistair effectively argues, exceptional theology, but writing it in story and allegory and metaphor instead of in logical, rational dissertation. And it speaks, Alistair McGrath argues, I think effectively and rightly, that it speaks to the modern generation in some ways better than the rational dissertation, Lewis. Jerry, comment on that.
There's two features of that, though, too. It is true, and what Stephanie said, too, Lewis's love of story is there, but it is true that we can have our reasons all figured out. And Lewis says, reason stands before the heart like dragon sentries. How do you get past the dragon sentries? Sometimes story can get past the dragon sentries. So I think that's absolutely true. But Lewis acknowledged in his letters, I'm Irish, so naturally I'm a storyteller. And that's true too, but then the storyteller needs to be cautious, because the persuasive person, we learn this even from Plato's Gorgias, the persuasive person is at risk of becoming an unjust person if they persuade people to do that which they wouldn't otherwise do. So we need to really be cautious and be centered down in our relationship with Christ, so we're using whatever giftedness we have and whatever means we have for good purposes.
All right.
So that we can build a place like this.
Well, this is story. When I was faced with the question of how to paint the ceiling, I decided to paint story. And so this is the meta-narrative of Scripture. It starts with humanity in the hands of God, because it's relationship. The relationship's destroyed with sin, and then the entire Old Testament is a prophetic interaction of God with humanity, proclaiming the cross, which is here, with the promise at the end of the story that God will again dwell with humanity in a new heaven and new earth. All right, so in preparation for this, I called my son. Now, my son is got more degrees than a thermometer. I don't know how else to say it. But part of his degrees included a master's and a doctorate in philosophy at Oxford. He continued to lecture there afterwards. And his area is, and to some degree, philosophy. And I told him about the panel, and I told him about my panelists. And he said, you need to ask Dr. Perez, that's what he called you, that's pretty good. You need to ask Dr. Perez about this. And I said, what's that? And Will said, I thought The Problem of Pain was a very good read. Will's a very critical reader. I mean, 3 degrees and a postdoc in philosophy and logic, very rigorous. He said, I thought it was a great read. He said, what I really appreciated about it, though, is Lewis anticipated the intellectual questions that would later be posed by very solid philosophers like Peter Van Inwagen and others on the issue of pain and the arguments of theodicy. And so I thought, wow, that's a tough question. So Dr. Perez, that's for you.
I've only had my doctorate for a few months, so I'm still very new to hearing Dr. Perez. It's still very surreal to me, so I appreciate that. Will is your son's name? Wherever you are, Will, thank you very much for that question. So how does Lewis in The Problem of Pain anticipate some later developments? So there's a few ideas that come to mind. One is that it used to be the case that the problem of evil or theodicy, which is our responses to the problem of evil, were primarily concerned with truth. Is it true that we can believe in God in the face of suffering and pain, right? So it's a matter of, are these arguments sound? Are they valid? Are the rules of inference correct? It's about logic. It's about truth. It's about reasoning. However, the discourse has shifted somewhat to not just from truth, but to meaning. Meaning, because there's a few developments that have happened. One is human beings are primarily meaning-seeking, meaning-making. Psychologically, we try to make as much meaning as we can. This is where stories come in as well, because they help us make meaning of ourselves, of events, of our identities, and especially of suffering. So one insight from psychology is if you cannot assimilate a potentially traumatic event into your meaning framework as part of your life story, it's going to remain traumatic. So you have to try to make meaning of a potentially traumatic event in order to cope with it better and try to move on as well as we can. So part of what Lewis anticipates, it's not just about, well, let me offer you a rationally persuasive argument. He does say that it's very important not to alienate people from the truth. So he says truth is very important, but at the same time, we have to use what he called the organ of meaning, which is our imagination, right? And say, well, what would this theodicy, what would this argument even mean if it were true? Because it's one thing for something to be true, but maybe you could care less. You could say, okay, it's true, so what? What does it mean for my life? What difference does it make? And part of what Lewis tries to show is, okay, well, if it's true that God is trying to work in us better versions of ourselves, that God's trying to make us more loving, more compassionate, more courageous to others, maybe this is what it could mean for the suffering that we see in the world, in and around us. So that's one development that I think Lewis properly anticipated. The second is, when I read this the first few times, I was struck on how personal Lewis is. So sometimes we think that it's only in A Grief Observed, which is the text he wrote. He did not intend to publish this. He wrote it as a coping mechanism for losing his wife, Helen Joy Davidman, right? This is very personal. It's very raw. It's a very different read than The Problem of Pain. And many people think, well, that's where he's being, personal and engaged and subjective, and that's very true. But there are also some moments in The Problem of Pain where he says, oh, you want to know what I act like when I'm suffering? Well, let me tell you, I'm a great coward, he says. I am a great coward. And he talks about these memories he had from his serving the war and how he saw dead bodies and bodies were crushed like beetles. And he's given us very vivid imagery, and he's drawing us in, not just into a philosophical conversation, but a very personal kind of discussion. And the reason why this is important is because there's been this movement among philosophers and theologians called anti-theodicy, which is the view that we need to stop answering the problem of evil, that it just introduces more problems, it's immoral, it actually hurts people who are suffering. And if that's true, let's just throw this away. Let's throw all the theodicy books away. They're introducing harm into the world, not helping us. And part of their argument is that they remain way too abstract, that they don't bring themselves into concrete instances of suffering. And that's exactly what I see Lewis doing, that he's weaving a story, he's developing an argument, but there are moments where he says, here I am, this is who I am, this is the experience I've had, let me talk to you on a more personal one-on-one basis. So those are at least two developments that I see in The Problem of Pain.
Yeah. Any others that want to comment on that?
I think that's really good, but also the question of the problem of evil didn't just come up just before Lewis's time or just after. This is a question that people have been wrestling with throughout history. We'll never get to all the books that have been written. But
Job.
Huh?
Job.
Exactly. And Lewis was informed of this literature. So he can anticipate some of this stuff because he's historically informed and anticipates by virtue of being informed. The other thing, too, is he has ended one of his essays, all studies should end in doubts. He's not saying that he didn't do good work, but he says nobody gets to plumb the truth all the way to its depths or see all of its applications. So every good study should open the door for more study. And I think that was important. The other thing is A Grief Observed. If you read A Severe Mercy, the letters he wrote to his student, Sheldon von Auken, after his wife died, you'll see many of the same themes. So it wasn't like he hadn't thought about that. So it gets back to your point, too, about the problem of pain. Even if a person's going to suffer, if they could read a book like that before they suffered, it could fortify them for those days when they come. Last thing, his chapter on animals in that book is the worst thing he ever wrote.
For those who don't know, he wrote a chapter on animal pain and said that animal pain predates human suffering, if I recall correctly.
Well, his answer to the problem of evil is suffering is sometimes caused by the ill use of free will, and suffering that we endure sometimes increases our soul. It increases our character. Animals don't have souls, so they're not suffering because of their bad decisions, and they're not suffering because their souls are going to be improved. So he's trying to answer the question, and he says, well, I think maybe the animals of Christians will have the righteousness of the Christian applied to them like we have the imputed righteousness of Christ. It's just nuts. And his good friend, Austin Farah, the Oxford University philosopher, said, writing about that, about Lewis after he passed away, he said, at that point, Lewis's imagination loosed itself from the bonds of reason.
All right. Well, I'm going to have Amy discuss this point as well, but I've got to take the moment and switch over to Stephanie, because Stephanie, you've done a lot with pseudonyms where people write under false names. And I think that Lewis initially was going to write some of this pseudonymously, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And you might have some insights as to not just why he'd want animal pain under someone else's name, but why might he write some of this under a pseudonym?
Yeah, so I looked at this subject for Lewis, and I looked at his history of using pseudonyms, and his first kind of use of synonyms was Spirits in Bondage in 1919, and then Dimer in 1926. He wrote these books of poetry, and he knew that he was writing in a style that was falling out of favor, and so by publishing under a pseudonym, it was a way of kind of putting it out there and testing the waters of how it was going to be received. It's kind of a cloak for his kind of professional, he's an earnest, he dearly wanted to be respected as a poet. He also had a scholarly career. These things were going on at the same time when he was young. And so he wanted to kind of separate these things and kind of protect his scholarly career and his public reputation when he was publishing these poems. So it was kind of, that's how he was using pseudonym in his early days. He also used it, he could be secretive and kind of, he had fun with them too. There's a magazine called Punch. Amy, you will know it. It's a British kind of lowbrow magazine. And and so Lewis he wrote to one of his friends that he would put poems in there under the pseudonym Nat Wick or NW. And he says to his friend, nobody knows this. This is a secret. So he had fun with that, but it was kind of a way of, in that case, again, like he wants to do it. He wants to play. He wants to play in like a medium he doesn't, isn't expected or something like this, but it's separate from his platform as a very famous, well-known scholar. So that's kind of how he used it. Or in A Grief Observed was very, very personal. And so his first instinct was to be like, I don't really want to just expose this very deeply personal matter to the world. I'm gonna publish it synonymously under N.W. Clark. And then he was convinced, like he was with The Problem of Pain, convinced by the editors to go ahead and publish under his own name. But there was some hesitancy. This is a man. This is a person with a huge reputation or a burgeoning reputation to protect. So he cared just as much. Maybe, I don't know. You and I'd probably care more than he would, but he did care about his reputation. He was human, and his use of pseudonyms kind of reflected that. Sometimes it was to play, and sometimes it was to protect something he felt vulnerable about.
Okay, so Jadiel wants to add something real quick, and I've seen Amy make like 5 notes to talk to her, so we're coming to all of your notes next.
Just a quick funny story about the pseudonym for A Grief Observed. So it was published under N.W. Clark, not Will Clark, the unknown scholar, but originally he had submitted a different pseudonym called Dimidius, which means split or halved, very appropriate for losing his wife. And he submitted to the publishing company of T.S. Eliot. And they had a relationship with each other. And then Lewis thought he was being secretive. Okay, I submitted this manuscript. It's just Dimidius. He receives a letter back by T.S. Eliot and says, "Dear Mr. Lewis, we would love to publish your manuscript. However, there's only one person in all of England that would choose Dimidius as a pseudonym for this text. Please choose a different one," and then would publish it. And that's how we landed with N.W. Clark.
That's fantastic. Amy, catch us up with your notes.
Well, sorry, I'm just really enjoying this myself, taking it all in. I mean, I was thinking about if we were to think about what the weaknesses were of The Problem of Pain and in particular of the book. Obviously, the chapter on animals is, but I also think there are some weaknesses in his articulation around how pain can be positive in the life of a believer. Just in terms of even attempting to do that in a book that is addressing the philosophical question of how God could exist and be loving, and this be the world there is. And to me, it speaks of him writing in that 1950s era, of an era where there is still this kind of I guess, quasi-nominal Christian faith. Whereas in our cultural context right now, there is so much moral horror and outrage at the harm in the world that to even attempt to make a case that good could come from harm would be just seen to be utterly horrific. And that's just ideas that I'm exploring at the moment. And obviously in Parliament, one of the things I was really, when you were there, was trying to address that. Is it possible to uphold the seriousness of harm and moral wrongdoing and at the same time talk about the possibility of redemption? And I don't think he grapples with that. And I think the second thing I would say is that reading this as a woman, at least 90% of the pain and suffering in this world that I would be engaging with would be with women who've been survivors of horrific assault and sexual assault. And for me, that is missing from this. The sort of lived experience of that kind of horror. Now, of course, he can't write about that. It's not a critique, but so sorry. Those are some of the thoughts I was thinking about.
I think that's wonderful. And Jerry started us on this with the animal chapter being the worst thing he ever wrote. But I'm sure Jerry's got some other things he doesn't like about the book. And I'd be interested, Stephanie and Jadiel, if y'all have things you don't like about the book.
About the book, Problem of Pain?
Yes, sir.
I liked it. It helped me.
Yeah.
I don't mean like the whole book's garbage. I just meant you're the one who said the chapter on animal pain is the worst thing he ever wrote.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, though, the things that I would disagree with are probably things where I'm wrong. I'm not the standard.
All right. Jadiel?
To defend, I found myself defending Lewis frequently, which I don't mind. But to defend I can't judge the writing of the chapter, the animal suffering, but there's a small article Lewis wrote on vivisection, which I think is a good corrective to the chapter he has here, actually. And he says, because in the Problem of Pain, he says, okay, animals don't have souls. Like, he's really confident. In this vivisection essay, he says, how certain are we that animals don't have souls? Do we want to take the moral risk? What if they do? What if they do have consciousnesses and we're here torturing them? And his whole case against vivisection is, I'm pretty confident they don't have souls. I'm pretty confident maybe they don't have a consciousness like us. But do we really want to take the moral risk of doing that? Let's not. So his whole case against vivisection is maybe there is something more to animals than what he presented in the Problem of Pain. And I certainly think that socially, Dr. Orr-Ewing is correct that it's not, I don't think it's helpful to try to speculate for others how good could come from their horrendous experiences of suffering. Part of what I've been researching this year with this grant that I mentioned is the same question psychologically. And at least in my research so far, it seems very important that for individuals to even try to redeem a potentially traumatic experience, they have to have some sort of story in which something good comes out of it. Now, it's harmful to impose that good. It's harmful to tell people what that good is, but they themselves, they need to be able to find some sort of good that comes out of even a traumatic experience in order to properly move on. And we just have to keep in mind also that grief is a very complicated process and people grieve differently. So absolutely, right after you experience a traumatic event, there's going to be a stage in which you don't want to hear theodicy. You don't want to hear explanations. You don't want to hear arguments. You're just surviving. You're just breathing, taking steps forward. You're just trying to hold on and not end things, right? But then there are other stages of grief. And I'm wondering, are there other stages in which a book like this could actually be helpful?
I'll jump onto that, if I may. Yeah, I mean, to that same kind of, in that same sentiment, I feel like in my early 20s or teenage years, this kind of work was appealing to me because I felt like I needed the apologetics. I needed to like have the armor that C.S. Lewis provided. But now I think, I mean, with as a blessing, I feel like I got that, and I don't need it as much. I mean, of course, I still need it. But it's there. I have it, and so when I was rereading this for this weekend, I was like, oh yeah, this is helpful. This is good. This feels like work. It feels like work. Whereas an imaginative, his storytelling, that's like, this is like where I want to be. I want to just, enjoy his space trilogy. But this feels like, okay, now let's get to it, and let's it's profitable and it's useful, and sometimes more in other phases of life and maybe less in other times.
Jerry?
Going back to what you said about vivisection, this is an essay Lewis wrote against animal experimentation. I mean, this is a guy who says, my neighbors trap the mice in their houses. I feed the ones I find in mine. I mean, he had a tender heart, always had animals and stuff like that. But it's true, he doesn't think animals have souls, but humans have souls. And if they treat their animals badly, it will affect their souls. And if you look at his fiction, this is probably where he makes the best case for it. All of his evil characters are cruel to animals, every one. Uncle Andrew's blowing up guinea pigs. You've got Weston, the worst, most heinous person in all of his books, is eviscerating these creatures on Perelandra. You've got the White Witch. She's beating the horses. You've got the NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. They do experiments on animals, and they start doing experiments on people. So he's saying it's indicative of something that's coming. And so we should be conscientious of it.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes apiece. So here is your 3-minute apiece closer. Favorite thing C.S. Lewis ever wrote, in your subjective opinion, what's your favorite thing and why? Who's going first?
You're looking at me.
I'm looking at you because I know you'll talk.
Chapter 17 of Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, the last book he wrote before he died. And he said, he said, gratitude exclaims very properly, how good of God to give me this. But adoration asks, what must that being be like whose far off and momentary coruscations are like this?
Say that again very slowly because of the acoustics in this room.
Gratitude exclaims very properly, how good of God to give me this. But adoration asks, what must that being be like whose far off and momentary coruscations are like this? One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. It's like Chesterton's, the world will never starve for want of wonders, only for want of wonder.
I can go next, and I'll answer this question relative to the theme of the panel, right, which is problem of pain and suffering. So a few years back, I shouldn't have favorite aunts, but I think we all do, right? We all have a favorite aunt, favorite cousins. My absolute favorite aunt, her name was Belinda. She passed away from breast cancer at the age of 44. Spent her whole life serving the Lord, doing ministry, and we were there for all of it. Absolutely devastating. And I hadn't read The Last Battle at the point, the Narnia Chronicle. And I was a mess, grieving. And to distract myself, I just started reading The Last Battle. And I remember how it ends. When the children are in front of Aslan, and they're so worried that they're going to be separated from him. And they are just like, Aslan, are you gonna send us back to Earth one more time? And Aslan says, haven't you figured it out yet? And they're a little confused. Oh yeah, there was a real railway accident. You are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. And what does that mean? That means we never have to leave each other again. And you don't have to leave, and we're going to be together. And he starts transforming his shape from a lion into the image of Christ. And that imaginative transformation of what could death be like on the other side was just exactly what my soul needed. And it allowed me to cope better with the loss and the grief. And it was that story that was really emotionally and spiritually nourishing for me in that moment.
That is amazing, because I was going to say that passage too. My then 11-year-old son had learned it for a poetry recitation at school, And my father-in-law died very suddenly, so my 11-year-old son recited that at his funeral. The term is over, the holidays have begun. Yeah, it was amazing. So I'll say something else. I think, and Jerry mentioned it earlier, in Lewis's writings on the Psalms, I think his writing on those imprecatory psalms, the psalms we just never want to talk about or think about, is really profound and really helpful. And as we struggle with morally different aspects of the Old Testament, when I was wrestling in particular with that, I remember finding that incredibly powerful. So probably his reflections on the Psalms in general, and that chapter in particular.
For me,
Okay, I'm sorry. I've got to interrupt for a moment. I know we say a lot of words differently here than you do over across the pond. But the way you pronounced imprecatory for the Psalms, would you say that again so I can hear it?
I probably said imprecatory. Is that wrong?
No. I'm sure over there that's right. Imprecatory. Imprecatory. Maybe we were wrong in Lubbock. But I mean,
Probably not.
when Lubbock we were growing up and we were fond of saying, don't you know the Queen's English? And our response would be, well, of course she is. What else would she be? Okay, Stephanie, yours.
I think my favorite are his letters to Arthur Greaves, because this is a friendship that started in Belfast, where he grew up as teenagers, and they were just bosom buddies. I don't know, how do you say it? Just very, very close, dear male friends. And they kept up this correspondence their entire lives. And it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. I mean, it makes me sad that we don't write letters more, and I think we should. I tried recently to write some letters. It's very hard. It's very difficult, and it's good practice, and it actually reveals to you what's going on with you, and it's a profound way of connecting with another person. So just that testament of that deep, lifelong male friendship was just beautiful.
You wanted us to say what moved us most, but could I say what I like things to conclude with most? 3 weeks before he died, Lewis got a letter from a little girl in America named Ruth. She was 11 years old. He's on his deathbed. He doesn't need to respond to it. He did, and we have it. Almost his last words. If you continue to love Jesus, nothing much will go wrong with you, and I pray you may always do so.
Before we thank them and they're through, I want to show you something. This is the copy of The Problem of Pain of my dear friend Jerry Root. It's hardback. It's worn. It's got tons of notes. It is an edition that was published by Macmillan.
It's an older edition.
About 30 years before Lewis wrote it.
30 years before.
And then we have the next generation of Lewis scholars with the trusty paperback that was published about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Then we have the next generation of Lewis with the electronic version. And you are in the middle here. Yeah, but you've got the LA artsy cover. All right, we've got 3 minutes before we'll close out with a word. Would you please, Amy, take these 3 minutes and give us a short taste of why everyone's going to want to come hear you tomorrow night? Okay, so this is a promo moment. All right.
Wow. Well, thank you. Gosh, I wasn't expecting to do that. That's really hard, but. So tomorrow night, we're going to be thinking about C.S. Lewis and the problem of pain. I guess putting his work around the Odyssey in the context of his life and the kind of impact that he had in Britain. We're going to think about his approach, his apologetic approach, and what we can learn from that, including not just the arguments he deployed, but the methodology, how he engaged with story, how he engaged actually with personal experience as well. We are going to go through the chapters of the problem of pain and give a kind of overview of each one and each chapter and think about how the book progresses. And we're also going to think about what some of the limitations are of that book for today, and how we might take into our own lives the principles and apply in our own apologetics, in our own cultural context, where the question of suffering is still very much alive and well, the problem of evil still very much in people's hearts and minds. Apply the principles, but more specifically today to our cultural context.
Fantastic.
They
Well,
should also come to hear her because she's really good.
oh, there's no question. Yeah, I think that's self-evident. So here's how we will conclude today. I'll say a word of thanks in prayer, and we will give appropriate applause to our panelists. And then I'm sure a lot of people will want to talk to them. And because a lot of people will want to talk to them, the tendency is to talk longer than will work because of everybody else that wants to talk to them as well. And at some point, they'll want to go use the restroom. So be deferential in your time commitment instead of launching into a 5-minute discussion about something too long. But do take a chance to greet them and show them some Texas hospitality. So let's close in prayer. Lord, we close lifting you up as a group of seekers who want to understand you more fully and want to demonstrate your love in this world more completely. We do live in a world of pain. We live in a world where there are a lot of evildoers who bring pain and inflict pain needlessly on others and wrongly on others. Now, we experience pain that's not intentional, it's unintentional. We experience pain in this world through loss and grief. And we understand, Lord, that you are beyond this world, and yet you are in this world, and you walk with us each step along the way. And so we pray that you will grow in us, not just a better understanding of you, but a better manifestation of your character, of who you are, how you care and love, and how we can show that to a hurting world. We pray all of these things because of who Jesus is and what he's done, and his understanding of suffering from a human perspective as well as a godly one. In his name, it's amen. Join me in thanking our panel, please.